So these last several classes, we've been following the trilogy of Socrates' final dialogues. Plato recorded many Socratic dialogues, of course. My favorite are these last three: Apology, Crito, and Phaedo. So Apology, again, the trial. Crito, while he's in prison, they're trying to convince him to escape. And then Phaedo, here we are, that's where we left off last class. But the interesting thing here is his most pivotal assertions in these. You know, think about the Apology. He's accused of impiety. And then what does he do in his defense speech? He proves, and he reproves, I should say, as well, everyone there. He says, I believe more than you all believe. Not only am I not an atheist, not only am I not impious, I believe more than any of you guys do. Any of you, he's talking to the whole jury there, condemning him to death for impiety. It's precisely because he's so pious that he's convicted of the charge of impiety. The irony there. Okay, so he goes off, his final words in that trial. He conveys how happy he is to die, how willing he is to die. He's not afraid of it. And in Crito, Crito fails to convince him to escape. That he believes would be an injustice. And he leaves off there. He leaves off that dialogue saying, okay, Crito, you haven't convinced me. You have nothing more to say, therefore let me follow the intimations of the will of God. It's his final line there. Then here we are in Phaedo. He's talking his literal final minutes. In fact, the actual death itself of Socrates is contained within this dialogue. He's trying to convince all of his friends there who came to support him at his moment of death. He's trying to convince them what? He's fine, that is he terrified? No, he's perfectly relaxed. He's trying to console them, not vice versa. Might not be the ordinary way you'd expect someone approaching his death to do it, but that's exactly how he does it. So he's trying to prove to them the existence and immortality of the soul in his usual extremely careful, reasoned manner. But in all these occasions, he kind of doesn't present any arguments for I guess you could call it the elephant in the living room. I don't know of any extensive, direct argument Socrates provides for the existence of God. He just takes it for granted. I think he thinks it's so, I guess he supposes it's so straightforward and obvious that it wouldn't be doubted by anyone, but so he doesn't present arguments for that, but the philosophers after him surely did. I was hoping I'd get to all this much earlier, but instead here we are at our last class. We'll have to polish off Phaedo, quickly dive back into where we left off with his argument for the existence of the soul, and then get into skipping 2,000 years or so to Middle Ages philosophers on their arguments for the existence of God. Okay, anyway, where we left off with Phaedo, really quickly polishing that off. We left off, I believe, with the argument from Affinity. And we had already talked about his argument from opposites. Life comes from death and vice versa. Neither one is destroyed. They're chased away. And he says the soul is the life of the body, but life being out to their death is not destroyed. Just like even and odd, they're not destroyed. Light and darkness, cold and heat. One doesn't destroy the other. It chases the other elsewhere. So when death comes, it chases the soul, namely life, out of the body, and that goes somewhere else. All right, but this argument here, this argument from Affinity, I think is more interesting. He says that the soul, and I'll paraphrase heavily here for the sake of time, there's many pages in the reading I gave you where he goes through this, but remember, Plato, Socrates, one of their fundamental teachings is on the forms. The forms are these ultra-real things. We speak of them, but we cannot touch them, but they are nevertheless real. Above all, goodness, truth, beauty, justice, things like that. He says, God bless you. He says, those aren't constructs of our imagination. Those aren't fictions that we invented to try to make reality make sense. He says those are realer than real. That's realer than the physical things we can actually touch. Sure, those are real also, although Plato kind of isn't too keen on the importance of those physical things, as Aristotle after him would be a big fan of them. But anyway, these forms, and not just the most exalted ones like goodness, truth, beauty, all the forms, number, quality, anything that however we describe something is a form, it's a quality. If it's this reality that we speak of, but we can't empirically identify it, but it's there. Those things they have certain essential characteristics. All of the forms have certain essential characteristics. I'm going to get to how this relates to the argument from affinity in a moment, but they are, above all, perfect, unchanging, and eternal. All the forms bear those qualities. Perfect, unchanging, and eternal. Okay, so we keep those in mind about the forms. And I should say, for the sake of this discussion, they're eternal / immortal. You can't kill number. You can't kill any of the forms. You can't kill goodness, truth, beauty. What does this have to do with the soul? Well, the soul has a receptivity to the forms. The soul can actually receive the forms into itself. You can, quite truly, with your soul, and again, mind, psyche, whatever, spirit, whatever you want to call it here, you can actually receive the forms into your soul. You can truly appreciate goodness, truth, beauty. You can receive these things into yourself. But how does one thing receive another? Except insofar as it bears the fundamental similarity to it in its essential characteristics. So this, I believe I talked about this in the pre-recorded lecture. You all hear me right now, but that's only possible because you have the capacity of hearing. We're talking here physically now, we're not talking about forms. Just physically, the air here is modulating in proportion to my voice, and that's being received by you in your eardrums. And the only way it's even possible for you to receive that is because your eardrum, what's going on with your eardrums right now? They're actually vibrating back and forth. How? It's the exact same frequency that my vocal cords are. And that you are quite literally acquiring a similarity right now. Purely physically, you are acquiring a similarity to my voice, and that's how you can receive it. You have that capacity, you have that faculty. That wouldn't be possible if you didn't have that faculty. You wouldn't be able to receive my voice as you are now. This is true with the other senses as well. Texture. I'm dragging my finger across this concrete here, and I can tell that it's rough. I can receive its roughness into myself, but I can only do that because my finger has enough flexibility in it that it can actually mold to the contours of this texture, and that's how I can tell. If I was just rolling a perfectly rigid thing over that surface, it wouldn't receive that form of roughness into itself. It wouldn't be able to ascertain the texture of this surface here. We could go through that with all sorts of things. But the general paradigm here is that for one thing to be receptive to another, it basically needs to exist in the same order of reality. It needs to be capable of receiving that into itself, which always happens if it does or can bear a similarity in its essential characteristics. The other example I used in the lecture online already, that we don't worry that I'm not worried that my tankard here is going to get sick if I accidentally put moldy coffee in it. Why do you not worry about a piece of pewter, a piece of metal here getting sick? And that's not, you get sick if you have moldy coffee. But a metal cup is not a biological thing. That doesn't even make sense. You could almost say, sure, these all exist in the same universe, but you could almost say it doesn't even exist in that same order of existence as biological realities. For all it knows, that's a whole different universe. That's a whole different order of nature. If we had, let's take it up a level still. If you have a plant, if we had a potted plant sitting right here, and it could, plants can get various sicknesses, not exactly like we do, but they can get blight and cancers and all sorts of things. So they do it because, why? Because they exist in that biological order, that general biological order. But if a terrifying monster walked in the door here, would you be concerned that that plant might be afraid? It doesn't exist in that order. It doesn't exist in the sensitive order of the universe. It can't receive that into itself. It's not because it's brave. It's because it's just, those are different planes of existence. Those are different realities almost. It doesn't even make sense to think about a plant getting scared or something. A dog could be in here and it could get very scared. It exists in that order. But if we take it up yet another level still, and this is Socrates' point, the human soul is receptive to all the forms. We can actually contemplate these things. You can mentally, psychologically, with your soul that is, engage in the contemplation of what is good and true, perfect, beautiful, completely abstract. You can actually receive these realities into your soul. But because these realities can be received into your soul must be like them in their fundamental characteristics. Your soul must be immortal, he's saying. That's my favorite argument he presents here. He presents a number. Again, you've got the argument from opposites there already. You want to have that down in your notes as well as the argument from affinity. You don't need to be able to explain them or anything for the final. Just have those written down, the names of them. He says, but we ourselves, we are part body and part soul, aren't we? His interlocutors respond, we are. Socrates, then to which kind do we say that the body will be more similar and more akin? Clearly the body is more similar to what is seen, but the soul is more similar to what is invisible, he says. The body, we all know that it will decay at some point, rot, be destroyed, because that's what happens to the things of its order of existence, its material order of existence. But the soul, he says, whereas whenever the soul studies alone by itself the forms, any form, it departs yonder toward what is pure and always existent and immortal and unvarying. And by virtue of its kinship with it, its affinity in other words, it enters always into its company, wherever it has come to be alone by itself, and wherever it may do so, then it has ceased from its wandering. And when it is about those objects, the forms, it is always constant and unvarying, because of its contact with things of a similar kind. And this is what we call wisdom. So Socrates is reminiscing of his many decades spent philosophizing, where he's really succeeded, like few others, in detaching his soul from the body and being completely absorbed in the contemplation of the forms. We've all done that to some extent, but this was his life. And because this was his life, he feels very ready for death, because death does that for us. Just rips the soul right out of the body, so he doesn't have to worry anymore about the soul being distracted because of the needs and desires of the body by the lower things that are changing all the time and imperfect and die eventually, unlike all this. Okay. Given that the immortal is also indestructible, then if it proves to be immortal, it will also be imperishable. His interlocutors agree, yes, it must be imperishable. Then when death attacks a person, Socrates says, the mortal part, that is the body, it seems that it dies, whereas the immortal part gets out of the way of death. It departs and it goes away intact. And he says, then beyond all doubt, the soul is immortal and imperishable, and our souls really will exist in Hades. And then his friend there responds, well, Socrates, for my part, I've got no further objection. I cannot doubt the argument at this point, he says. So Socrates concludes, he says, one should repeat such things to oneself like a spell, which is just why I've so prolonged the tale. For those reasons, then, any man should have confidence for his own soul, who during his life has rejected the pleasures of the body and its adornments as alien, thinking they do more harm than good, but has devoted himself to the pleasures of learning, has decked his soul with no alien adornment, but with its own, temperance, justice, bravery, liberality, truth. Thus awaiting the journey he will make to Hades whenever destiny shall summon him. Now as for you, Simmias and Cebes and the rest, you will make your several journeys at some future time. But for myself, even now, as a tragic hero might say, destiny doth summon me. And it's just about time I took my bath. For it seems better for me to take a bath before drinking the poison, instead of leaving the women the trouble of washing a dead body. So that's one of his final actual acts of life here as an act of charity. Figure, all right, I'm about to die, might as well take a bath now while I still can, so don't have to give these workers here the bother of having to washing a corpse. And then, this is interesting here, one of his friends says, how are we to bury you? He says, however you wish, if you can catch me. Why did he say that? Was weird. Why did he respond that? Let me give one more line here and then you'll see what he's getting at. When I drink the poison, I will no longer remain with you. I'll go off for some happy state of the blessed. Because so he knows what they mean. But his point is, and he says it in the next minute here, he says, you can be sure, Crito's also there, misuse of words is not only troublesome in itself, but it has a bad effect on the soul. His point was, if you guys are asking me, how should we bury you? When you say you or I, you're referring to your body and your soul together. So if you say, how should I bury you, you're implying, inadvertently of course, but you're implying what?
That the soul and body are one.
Yeah, and that you're going to bury him alive, in other words. And that's of course not what they're implying here, but Socrates is being a stickler with these things because he says, and he's got a good point, he says when you deliberately misuse words, even if it's just a euphemism, even if you know what you mean, that has a bad effect on the soul. You have to speak in accordance with reality. He says you can't just change what you're saying to suit whatever. You've got to be very careful with how you speak, because if you don't preserve this care with how we speak, well, eventually, and if we speak in ways that don't accord with reality, that don't accord with the truth, you speak this way year after year after year, eventually you'll find yourself believing what you say instead of reality. So you got to be so careful there. He says it's got a bad effect on the soul if you just misuse words like that. Speak in accordance with the truth. You will bury a corpse. You will not bury me. I'll be gone, he says. I'll be somewhere else. So the prison official comes in, in other words, the executioner. He says, in your time here, Socrates, I've known you for the most generous and gentlest and best of men who have ever come to this place. So the executioner praises him. Socrates displays the fruits of a good philosophy to the very end. And then here comes a cup of poison, and he says, but at least one may pray to the gods, and so one should, that the removal of this world to the next will be a happy one. And that is my own prayer, so may it be. With these words, he pressed the cups to his lips, drank it off with good humor. No poison in here, don't worry. And without the least distaste. Everyone breaks down in tears there, except Socrates himself. He's the only one who's completely fine with what's happening. He reproves them gently and short, telling them not to act like that. And his final words were to tell Crito to sacrifice a rooster to some god as an act of piety. He says, oh, we forgot to do that. Make sure that's done. So it's kind of, people have speculated with endless pages on what hidden meaning there is in that. But I just take it for what it is. A final act of piety from the man condemned to death for impiety. And then the dialogue itself ends, because remember, this is someone recounting the experience. It's not a direct witness giving the dialogue here. And then with that, Socrates was the end of our companion. A man who, among those of his time we knew, was, so we should say, the best and the wisest too, and the most just. The end of Socrates. All right, not the end, of course, but the end of what he has to say. There goes Phaedo. All right, so let's skip 2,000 years. Kind of a bummer that we have skipped 2,000 years here in the course of one 50-minute class, which, oh my goodness, is already half over, and I've got to take the last 25 minutes here to present the Middle Ages philosophers' arguments for God. This is going to be interesting. Before the arguments for God that they present, actually, first how they address the primary argument against God. And everyone has brought this up since the ancient days. The first time it was specifically formulated, I think, was actually in ancient Greece. Now I can't remember the name of the individual person who did this, but he says if there's a God, then he must either not be good or not be all-powerful. Why? Because there's evil. We all realize, I don't think, there's this power of positive thinking thing where you just try to pretend that everything's good and it's not. And some people that works for them for maybe a few days when they're really on drugs or something, but it doesn't last long because it's pretty obvious that not everything's good, not everything's hunky-dory, there's evil. How on earth could the existence of such horrendous evil as there is in the world be possibly reconciled with the existence of a God who's all good and all powerful? Because the argument's pretty straightforward. I don't even think we need to lay it out in detail here. I mean, it's intuitive to almost anyone. If he exists and he's all good, he wouldn't want evil. So it must be that he doesn't get rid of it just because he's not all powerful. Or maybe he exists and is all powerful, but then he must not be good because there's still evil. Because we witness the fact that there's evil in the world. So the philosophers in the Middle Ages address this in a few ways. Augustine says, and this is all in detail in the pre-recorded lecture, so I'll just quickly say it here as a preface to the next argument that'll hopefully get on the board. He says, first of all, evil is not a substance. Anything that has a positive existence, they would attribute to the design of God. Any positively, meaning affirmatively existing thing, sure, those would have to be created by God. But they say evil is not like that. Evil is like a shadow. It's real, you can't deny it's there, but it doesn't have its own existence. Any shadow can only even be identified. We speak of shadows as if there's sometimes we speak of shadows as if they're these real things that have some sort of existence of their own, but they don't. I can only even make sense of the notion of a specific individual shadow, and we can use physical examples here easily. Like if I'm pointing at that shadow right there, that little one, sure, that's obviously there. We all agree, I'm sure there's a shadow right there. How do I even define the existence of that particular shadow? What's it defined by virtue of?
Only in relation to the thing that actually exists.
Exactly. The only way I can identify this little shadow here, wish I had a better one on the board, but the only way I can even identify this shadow is by this light, by the boundary of light that encapsulates it. It's the only way to even make any sense whatsoever of the existence of a particular shadow. And Augustine, and pretty much all the philosophers of the major religious traditions throughout thousands of years, whether it's Christian or Jewish or Islamic or anything really, they would basically agree on this point for the most part, that they acknowledge the existence of evil, but they define it by virtue of the privation of the good that we intuit should exist. We intuitively, we observe human nature and we say there's a good about human nature. It's supposed to be a certain thing. It's supposed to be happy, it's supposed to be healthy, it's supposed to be all these things. When we look at pain and suffering and unhappiness, all of that stuff, it's only identified as an evil in relation to what it's supposed to be, namely the good. So it's a privation of that good. There's no real nature of what this chalk is supposed to be. So we don't, if I just do that with that piece of chalk and break it in half, this isn't a great evil, because it's not a privation of anything that's nature, really. Maybe I shouldn't have, because maybe someone could have really used that now they can't because it's half the size. But anyway, hopefully that makes some sense at least. All evil, yes, it's real and it's horrendous. It can be horrendous, but it's still not a real thing on its own. It's a lack of what should be there. And that should be, that thing that should be there, well, that's what God made. But what I just gave you, that's not exactly the most satisfying answer. I would fully admit, Because you could still respond to that and say, okay, God didn't make evil, sure. But if he exists and he's all good and he's all powerful, he could still get rid of it by at least filling in the voids with the good. He could still do that. We have to at least metaphysically, philosophically acknowledge that if we're going to say he exists and he's all good and he's all powerful. We've got to at least acknowledge that he could get rid of evil, so why not? And that's where Aquinas comes in. He says, well, he will. We're in a very temporary time here where for some reason he's allowing a brief period of time with evil. He says it won't last for very long. But even now, he only allows any particular evil if he knows, because the philosophers all say knows the future. So he will only allow any evil whatsoever. The only way he could possibly reconcile any evil with these attributes of God's existence and goodness and power is if there is a good that will come from that evil. First prerequisite. Second prerequisite, the good that comes from that evil will be even greater than the evil that was permitted to occur. And then the third prerequisite, because God we could still say, okay, well, why not just do it some other way? Why not bring about that good some other way? So the third prerequisite, just philosophically here, would be there has to be no other logically possible way to bring about that good. Because even an all-powerful being can't do something logically incoherent. Because a logically meaningless assertion, it's not just difficult, it's just unreal. It's not a thing. A square circle is not a thing. Not even an all-powerful God can make a square circle. This just doesn't make any sense. It would, if you started it off as a circle and gave it corners, it wouldn't be a circle anymore. So that's probably the most consoling, purely philosophical thing you could ever ruminate on. And of course, it presupposes a couple things that we haven't proven. But if you do believe in a God that's good and powerful, that's all good and all powerful, simple philosophy tells you that any evil, any unfortunate thing in your own life or in the world or anywhere in between, is absolutely philosophically guaranteed to eventually turn into a greater good. And that's just philosophy that says that. Okay. But we still haven't talked about his existence itself. And that brings us all the way, so Augustine, by the way, was the 400s, so he was only 800 or so years after Socrates. We got to fast forward another 1,000 years to get to Aquinas. But this is still the general era of Middle Ages philosophy from Augustine to Aquinas and shortly thereafter. Aquinas gave the most famous, there's millions of arguments for and against God, obviously, but the most famous of all philosophical arguments for God would be the 5 ways that Thomas Aquinas gave. Aquinas' 5 ways. You want to make sure you have these down your notes before the final. I'm going to just toss on the board real quick an extremely abbreviated version of them, because I know I'm going to just run out of time way before I wanted to. But if you have down the first unmoved mover, says there must be some unmoved mover to initiate the chain of motion in the world. Similarly, second way, there must be some uncaused cause from which all causes derive their being. He says third way, there must be some absolutely necessary non-contingent being. Otherwise, the universe would have no fundamental ground of existence. Fourth, there must be some absolute standard of perfection against which all other perfections are measured. Think back to the meter analogy we talked about in an earlier class. The only reason that any measurement whatsoever can even make sense is because there is an absolute definition somewhere of like the meter. And that's what all other meters are measured against. But if we zoom out and speak of all perfections, there must be some absolute perfection against which all goods are measured. And he said, and all these proofs, he's not at all presenting these as Christian proofs or Jewish proofs, these are just philosophical. He's not saying there's an unmoved mover therefore accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior or something. He's not saying that. He's just saying, look, we see things moving, that's got to come from somewhere. Ultimately, there must have been some first unmoved mover that initiated it all, and we call that God. There's a million steps in between that and any specific religious claims. Of course, Aquinas is not pretending otherwise. He's just giving some abstract arguments here about God. I don't think you'll find a Church of the Unmoved Mover anywhere in the world. Maybe some really weird philosophers have something like that, but I haven't found one. 5, there must be a designer with intelligence. Very paraphrased right there. That's not exactly how you'll see him describe it in the Summa Theologica, but that's the gist of them. Before spending a few minutes here, at least, talking about one of these maybe, a general point is in order. Because the obvious response to any of these, which of course, if a parrot could say it, I think Aquinas was aware of this objection. You say, okay, well, so God's the unmoved mover, well then who moved him? Okay, well God's the uncaused cause, who caused him? God's the designer, who designed him? The point here is not to say that we can understand any of those answers. We can't. Aquinas would readily grant that we can't possibly comprehend how God can be unmoved, uncaused, undesigned, yet designing. The point of all of these proofs, all these arguments, is just to bring us to the point where we acknowledge that what is evident within, what is clearly the case within nature, within the observable universe, in other words, all things that are empirically graspable, everything, what is clearly happening within nature cannot itself be described by that which is within nature. His point is just that we have to posit something beyond nature to explain what we already see happening within nature. Some higher power, something, some being beyond anything we could possibly reach with our telescopes and microscopes and instruments and scientific theories. Just something beyond that whole order of existence that gave the impetus to that order of existence, to have what we can see with our own eyes it has. It's got motion. So think of, analogously, think of a billiard table, a pool table. Pretend we're all billiard balls on a pool table for a moment. We're all bouncing around like crazy, talking to each other. But our universe is just the boundaries of the pool table itself. That's all we can possibly reach with anything we can quote see as billiard balls bouncing around the pool table here. One billiard ball could say to the other, well, how are you moving? Where did this motion come from? He could say, well, the 3 ball, I can't remember how pool works. How many balls are there in a pool game?
8, I think.
The 8 ball's the bad one, right?
Yes, that's the bad.
So that's like
you want to hit that last.
Okay. Yeah.
You still have to hit it, but you have to hit it last.
Okay. And then of course the white one's the one you hit. What's that called? The cue ball. All right. So the cue ball. So the analogy here, we're looking at where we're all billiard balls bouncing around the table at some point, during the motion, after the hit. We're talking to each other saying, well, how are you moving? How are you doing what you're doing? Well, and he says, well, this other ball hit me. And then he asked that ball, well, how are you doing? What were you doing? And he said, well, what do you mean? It's just this other ball bounced into me. All of these billiard balls bouncing around the table, they could, if we personify them for a moment here in the analogy, they can absolutely certainly say, we are moving. But they can just as absolutely certainly say, looking at everything in our universe, the felt, the sides, the holes, there's absolutely nothing in this universe that can explain what is happening in this universe. There's no cause of motion that could have made us all start bouncing around like this. God bless you. The felt doesn't have that much friction. The sides, we're just bouncing off it. We're not getting any input of energy from the sides. This doesn't make sense if all we do is consider our own little universe here. We have to posit at least what these billiard balls could conclude. We've got to posit what. But at some point, there was a
Source of energy.
an initial source, exactly. At some point, there was some initial impetus from something outside our universe. Remember, our universe is the pool table in this analogy. They could at least conclude that. they can't, just with that kind of reasoning, they can't say anything about they can't conclude anything about the individual holding the pool stick, of course, but they could say, at some point, something outside of this universe intervened. And it gave the possibility, it enabled the reality of what we're seeing transpiring with our own eyes, our own pool ball eyes here. We see these things, they're facts. But these facts can't be explained without at least positing the existence of something beyond this pool table to give these facts their basis. Aquinas says that's the case with the universe. Its motion, its causality, the ground of its very existence. Why does the universe still exist? If it wasn't created by God, it always existed. Even the Big Bang, okay, well, what created the Big Bang? We can always just say it must have always existed. But there's always a possibility that anything material could simply cease existing. Physicists tell us any individual particle, for example, could quantum tunnel out of existence. But if it could happen, and if the universe existed for an infinite amount of time, it would, the universe as we know it, of course, they don't say that it existed for an infinite amount of time, but again, back to the Big Bang. But if there were an infinite universe, all the way back in time, there would be no grounds for it still existing without an absolutely necessary being beyond it. It would have simply dissipated already. Second law of thermodynamics tells us that it guarantees actually the heat death of the physical universe. Not only all matter, but all energy, dissipated into oblivion. So we can't put our hopes in energy either, I suppose. But anyway, the Aquinas says there must be some absolutely non-contingent, meaning not merely possible but necessary, some ontologically necessary being to ground the universe. Standard perfection, we talked about that. What is most interesting here is the final way. Because this is the most obvious to our senses. We look around, well, I guess motion is the most immediately obvious, but if you think for a moment, you look at yourself, others, plants, animals, all of these things are machines, you could say, in part machines, whose design is so radically beyond anything. I mean, the tiniest little mosquito is so radically beyond anything that the greatest human inventors and scientists could possibly make. And then we ponder, where did this come from? We didn't make it. We didn't make our city. I've got 5 kids, and I can assure you I didn't make any of them. I was obviously involved, but I did not make them. I can't even draw a tree, much less make a human being. So where on earth did we come from? Well, the most immediate explanation for that, of course, we're on this 5th way here, would be, well, what do you mean? Who made it? All life simply, what? All living things simply, where did I put my chalk? They simply evolved. But we don't need to even get into a debate on evolution. Let's just take it for granted. Let's just take all that for granted. This is ignoring the whole point of all if we just stop there, though, we're ignoring the point of all these 5 ways, which is to look at how it all started. And I'll quickly run through this, because judging by the discussion board, I think most students didn't see this on the pre-recorded lecture. Even if we grant all the arguments made in evolutionary biology, it still presupposes that it all started with, at the bare minimum, one single-cell organism capable of evolving, what evolutionary biologists call the LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. A single cell capable of evolving, too, is something of such extraordinary design and functionality that the best scientists have been trying for many, many years to create one on their own. They can't. Sure, they've stuck a few parts of already living things together and called it synthetic life, but it isn't. They haven't actually succeeded. But the argument goes, that I'll bring up here what I did in the pre-recorded lecture. You give for example, that if you give mere chance enough time, it will simply generate order. If you give a monkey a typewriter, it'll eventually, this is a common, Shakespeare, yeah, this is a common phrase, a common expression, which unfortunately is almost never tested against reason. What's the chance of the monkey getting the first letter correct?
126.
What's the chance of the monkey getting the second letter correct also? How do I calculate that?
1/26.
Exactly, another 1/26, and what operation do I use here?
And exponent of 2.
I'll use an exponent of 2, exactly, so multiplication, and you got to exponent because of course we don't want to do this the number of times that there are letters in, let's just take one work of Shakespeare, Hamlet, there's 130,000 letters in that, so all we have to do to calculate the odds of this happening, I do 1/26 times 1/26 130,000 times. You don't need to do that. We have exponents. Can anyone type that into their calculator real quick and tell me what it tells you? 1/26 to the 130,000th power. I meant to bring a calculator with me today and forgot to. But let me see if I can do this here. Unless anyone beats me to it. How do I even get a calculator? We've got so many apps, so much functionality, I can't do the basic things in one. I'll do it on my computer here. You can type this into any calculator, and it will give you the correct answer. Does anybody get anything? I just want to make sure that you guys realize I'm not making anything up here. I want to come from somebody. I'm not in cahoots with anyone here. It's just not pre-planned. Did anyone? Did you get anything? Did we able to type it in?
I can't figure out how to do fractions on anything. I watched the video and it
Okay.
calculated.
So no matter what calculator you type this into, it'll give you the correct answer. Calculators tend to do that. 0. It's mathematically equivalent to 0. There's no difference between that and 0 for any theoretically possible use. That's just Hamlet. Hamlet is nothing in its complexity and its deliberate functional order compared to the most basic, simplest possible Lugia. I've continued the calculation and I haven't done this in many years, we don't have time to right now anyway, but if you pretended that every particle in the universe was a monkey with a typewriter and each one was pounding out at a very high rate words, and each one had the entire history of the universe to do it. If you give that argument every single possible benefit of the doubt, you'll still get 0 here. It's mathematically impossible. When we see ordered things with such specific, deliberate order that their functional design cannot be denied, we're stuck concluding that something deliberately designed that. And that's something, Aquinas says, we all call God. Somebody made us. If aliens made us, somebody made them. Whatever. Again, the point here is not that Aquinas is saying you conclude all sorts of details about God with this, but simply that you can conclude something had to have made us. Something not in this universe. Something, in other words, not natural, which is to say something supernatural. He's just getting us to acknowledge a realm of mystery, because there's no room for mystery in mechanics. A mysterious explanation is another way of looking at this. It's saying a mysterious explanation is needed. It's absolutely logically needed, simply to account for what is absolutely true, which we can see with our own eyes, with our own senses. That is all he's really getting at with all these 5 ways. So that's 2,000 years there. But hey, if I can leave you guys from this whole class of philosophy with concluding that you have a soul, it matters, you're stuck with it forever and there's a God, I feel like I've done my job.